All right, team, let's continue our discussion of motor control theories. We're diving into part 3. We're still in hierarchical control or hierarchical theory. Let's look at Brunstrom. So Signe Bernström in the 60s came up with this idea of synergy patterns, specifically abnormal ones. So this was in the context of stroke rehab. Now, in stroke, an event can occur in which a person kind of moves into these stereotyped patterns that we usually call synergies. So these are abnormal ones. Okay, so remember there are normal ones like scapulohumeral rhythm, which we'll look at here in a second. And then there are abnormal ones like, let's look at this graphic here, like this. So this individual has experienced a stroke, and I particularly like this image because they're in a flexor synergy of the upper and lower extremities. So the text there gives you a description of what is occurring at each joint, and note that the patient is stuck like this. This is not volitional. This is happening without them wanting it to happen. So this is an abnormal synergy. Brunstrom posited that when this occurs after a stroke and sometimes after a brain injury, that to help this person kind of reestablish balance in their movements, because, good luck doing anything with your hand all tucked up like that, that you would want to emphasize the opposite side. So if that patient had significant elbow flexion, you would want to stretch it out and emphasize tricep extension to balance it back out, and that would reestablish more typical or normal movement patterns. Another thing Brunstrom is known for is for the stages of stroke recovery that she posited. So there's a pattern of spasticity which occurs. Spasticity being increased resting tension of the muscle, which is how that person kind of got stuck like that, if you will. The person in that image is probably in Brunstrom level 3, increased spasticity. You'll dig more into this your second year in neurorehabilitation, but suffice it to say that Brunstrom created a kind of a classic way in which spasticity rises and then falls during the course of recovery after stroke. Not everybody goes through all 6 stages of Brunstrom. Some people stay in stage 1, some people stay at stage 4. And that's for keeps, for life, if you will. But the essence here is that this is a pattern that she described, and I would say, even though this is kind of old, this holds up in my practice, I would say. Yeah, like if I have patients that are post-stroke, the prediction described here by Brunstrom holds up. It really does. Okay, next in hierarchical control, Cabot, Noss, and Voss. Cabot, Knott, and Voss. So these folks are responsible for PNF. Back in the 40s and 50s, it was over some time, they developed proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation as a concept and a practice pattern. So this practice emphasizes movement patterns and techniques along diagonals. So you're probably already familiar with this, but in case it's been a minute, we'll glance at it briefly. This is the idea that the therapist's hand placement, encouragement of certain movement patterns or facilitation, as well as like the language they use, their verbal cues, all can kind of work within this framework to improve range of motion, strength, endurance, all number of things. So let's look at a picture here. So the famous D1 and D2, flexion and extension, and very specific cues on what to do. You can see that PNF can apply to these synergy patterns because it's actually moving in and out of a synergy here, an abnormal one, in the case of somebody who's had a neurologic injury. Note that the endpoint there of D1 flexion is a little bit similar to the flexion synergy that we saw in the individual who had the stroke earlier. So that's just kind of a way to look at it. And so PNF is sometimes a way that therapists try to get patients out of an abnormal synergy. And as they do so, the handholds are incredibly specific. The idea being that wherever you're touching, that's a muscle that needs to activate. So this is a very energy-intensive form of treatment. If you're cold, do some PNF on your patient, and you, the therapist, will warm up pretty well. You and the patient are likely to be sweating soon, depending on the type of PNF pattern or kind of like mode of doing it that you're engaging in. So this you'll go through PNF patterns your second year in neurorehabilitation. They're good to know. I would say, though, that PNF is another one of those traditions that's on that same list that the ANPT put out that says, hey, this doesn't really work. It doesn't have evidence behind it. And you will also have therapists who are traditional, who have spent their careers using PNF and use it on virtually all of their neuro patients and swear by it, to demonstrate its attributes, things like that. So be mindful of that in terms of our kind of like professional interactions with CIs. If you have a CI that expects you to be competent in PNF. So just kind of giving a little frame of reference there. For myself, at this point in my career, let's see, I would say PNF is probably, 1% of my practice, maybe 2%. I use it, not very much. Maybe I'm being a little harsh, maybe 3%, but I don't use it very much. There's situations in which I think it's beneficial, but overall, I have other ways of achieving this. Interestingly, that's my neuro patients. My complex ortho patients, so these are folks who've had like big polytrauma, I actually would say PNF is more like 5 to 6% of my practice if I'm working with an orthopedic patient. I like it for getting things going so that they trust their limb again. I guess I'm using it more for the psychologic attributes. So I think it's nice for upper extremities. They've been in like a horrible highway speed car crash and multiple things were fractured, including a scap. I mean, a fractured scapula, insanely painful. They pin it all back together and then, good luck getting the range back, right? So I think it can be helpful. I also sometimes use PNF in a respiratory context, like in a pulmonary rehab context, to get ribs going again. But yeah, it's not like a bedrock, like neuroplasticity or something else. Okay, so let's move to another tradition. Motor programming. Motor programming theory is classically known for its concept of central pattern generators. Note that the abbreviation here is CPG. When we're in motor control and we're talking about CPGs, it's always referring to central pattern generators. But outside of the context of motor control, typically in PT, CPGs refers to clinical practice guidelines, which are these great big documents that the APTA puts out that basically like set the standard for the most evidence-based practice for a certain diagnosis or field or discipline or something. Mostly diagnosis, yeah. So CPGs and motor control. So this is the idea of a motor response that is hardwired into the spinal cord, actually. And the classic one here is walking. So the idea is that the motor control of walking sometimes kind of lives in the spinal cord, and it's activation of muscles that is kind of almost reflexive, and it tends to be activated by a sensory stimulus. So let's look at a really nice example of this. Again, we're coming back to pediatrics that I think can give us a good window into this. So this is actually, this person here is a PT, and this is her, I think this is her little one. So this baby is 5 weeks old, and watch that. The foot makes contact with a surface and stepping occurs. Incredible. So this is the idea of a CPG. So obviously this baby is far too young from an orthopedic standpoint to be walking. And you might notice the inversion there of the feet. The baby was born about 9 pounds. There's a little bit of crowding in utero, so it'll straighten out. But yes, so this little one is demonstrating a good example of how the idea of a CPG came about. If you take a look in Shumway Cook, you'll also see descriptions on animal studies, and I know they're upsetting, but they made spinal cord injuries on cats and then put them on treadmills and basically found that with sensory stimulation, the cats would still take steps, which is kind of wild because with the spinal cord injury, they were, the hind limbs were, divorced from the control of the cortex of the brain. So this implies that there is a central pattern generator which lives at the level of the spine. Now, the good thing about this theory, I would say, is that it began the idea of functional movement as part of rehabilitation, the idea of taking advantage of the possibility of a central pattern generator to recover movement that had been lost. So this really got people into the idea of if somebody has had a neurologic injury, like a stroke, and their right leg is now weak and so they can't stand up, like sit-to-stands are not going well. It used to be more so that we would have them do long arc quads with, a 3-pound weight on the ankle on the weak side, and that eventually that would build the quad strength to permit the sit-to-stand motion. This theory posited that because walking and standing and things like that are kind of hardwired into us at the level of the spine, that you actually want to work the task itself to regain motion. So If you're bad at sit to stand, do sit to stand is the essence here, whatever it is. And this plays out in a lot of different ways that aren't necessarily CPGs. We're going to talk about this more later with the idea of neuroplasticity. So motor programming theory has a limitation in that, look, it's not the only reason you walk, and there's the whole sensory thing. You can do plenty of things without sensory, but it is a good idea. And there's some research coming out that kind of like takes this idea in different directions, but in essence, I think where its strength really lies is in the idea of retraining movement by doing the movement. It might be in pieces, it might be with a lot of help and things like that, but that's the basic here. Systems theory. All right, this is a big one, y'all. So systems theory is, again, some of this might not seem like rocket science. Like, well, yeah, but that's because you've been existing in a modern world. Part of this this lecture here is a little bit the history of our profession, So back in the day, I think this is 80s, Bernstein said that, look, you can't understand movement from only the standpoint of looking at how the brain works. You also need to understand, the body itself and the environment it's in. So this is that individual environment task perspective we did earlier with the unusual example of motor production of speech in a stressful environment. So this was just a better way of looking at kind of that holistic whole body view as well as the environment. So the perception, the way someone thinks, the actual motor processes, the whole body as a biomechanical system, that's systems theory. So it's the idea of putting it all together. Bernstein also posited that synergies, these are normal synergies, okay, play a role in solving our degrees of freedom problems. So let's look at that here in just a second. Okay, degrees of freedom. Let's define it a little better. So this is a viewpoint that looks at the body in terms of like its physics, its mechanics. So I kind of like to joke that the body is just a bunch of hinges and sockets that, ball and socket joints that just need to avoid being either a jellyfish or a tin man. So if you are activating none of your muscles, or some muscles aren't activating enough, you're going to be too floppy. And we can take our example of kind of scooching back a bit and trying to reach out towards something. So right now I'm sitting in a chair, I'm going to reach out and use my arm to take my finger and touch my keyboard. So I could do this by not turning on any of the muscles in my biceps, in which I'm going to kind of like do this like weird kind of deltoid internal rotation thing to get, there we go, to get my hand over to touch the keyboard. So this is kind of that like uncoordinated movement that we sometimes see, and that's kind of a jellyfish problem. Or if all of your muscles are trained at the same time, so now go ahead and reach out for the keyboard, but make your wrist and your elbow stiff. You're going to need to like really, let's adduct the shoulder and get it there for the finger. Yeah, so this is how a synergy works. It gets just enough muscles firing to make the movement happen, while also just enough muscles not firing to prevent, the opposite happening and the movement isn't successful. So the coordination of synergies results in beautiful movement. You'll hear me say this a lot. Beautiful movement is like the goal of rehabilitation. It's the idea that, have you heard this pop culture idea that you only use, was it 10% of your brain? Yeah, no, you need the whole thing. A lot of the brain is actually making your movements coordinated. Raw movement is really gross. It's very ugly. It's very jerky, kind of like these unusual, almost like ratchety movements of the limbs. And you'll see that after neurologic injury. And as control is regained, then the movement smooths out and becomes beautiful. So that like other part of your brain that I guess 90%, it's not that much, but a good chunk of your brain is actually just smoothing out your movement to make it more controlled. So synergies are how that can happen. It's coordinated activation of the right muscle at the right time to move a joint in a particular way. A nice, like more easily digestible example of this is going to be the shoulder and overhead reach. The glenohumeral joint and the scapulothoracic joint are two different joints. And yes, in terms of like layman's terms, we call it the shoulder, but it's two separate joints and they have to coordinate together. Without proper coordination, you're going to have a jellyfish tin man problem. So with them working together, that's a synergy. The right muscles turning on the right amount at the right time. Lower trap doesn't fire, you know what that is. Serratus anterior doesn't fire, you know what that is, right? You get all these like winging weird things. Or they fire at the wrong time, what have you. Jellyfish arm, tin man arm. Too loose, too stiff. But smoothly turn on the right amount at the right time, and you can raise your hand in class, okay? So the synergy here is how you solve the degrees of freedom problem. In other words, how to get things to coordinate? Well, synergies, coordinated activation of muscles. Another way to look at this is in self-organization. So self-organization is a concept found in nature. So this is the idea of birds flocking together or clouds forming. There's no one in charge of making those things happen. It's just a phenomenon in nature. And in essence, it's a lot of things that just tend to get more ordered when they're in groups. It's a bit more mathematical, but it kind of gets the essence of what we're looking at here. So our real viewpoint here is self-organization as another idea for a solution to the degrees of freedom problem. Now, all the language on here is super kind of like out pie in the sky, oh my God, what are we even talking about? But it's just the idea of taking the focus away from the brain as steering everything and acknowledging the tissue properties of the bones, muscles, nerves, and all of that. So the innate properties of the way that bone is, the way that muscle is, tendons, ligaments, all those different structures in your arms and legs and your trunk play a role in how you move, which again sounds obvious, but this was novel at the time. And it's also just the idea that like the angles that they create with each other, the way that they are innately, tends to make more of an organized motion, really. So this is just that general principle. And we'll kind of explore this later. This is a really challenging one, to be honest. I'm not going to test you too hard on self-organization because that is super, super out there. I think if you're comfortable with like definitions and stuff like that, you're okay. But in terms of application, I mean, my 3 examples here aren't even human, right? So it's the schooling of fish, the grouping of birds together to make those cool patterns in the sky, and when fire ants need to cross over something, they just like hold each other's arms and legs and whatnot, and I guess it's all legs, but they just like hold on to each other without anyone telling them what to do, It's just self-organizing behavior. So it's more of an idea rather than something that, this is research side, yeah. This is like motor control research, so if you're more interested, we'll find a biomechanist who can walk us through it better, but yeah, just be comfortable with definitions and I think you're okay. All right, more systems theory. Okay, so there is a sub-theory within systems theory called dynamic theory. This sub-theory is really interesting. So, dynamic theory, I swear, dynamic theory, when I really was first practicing, really shifted my gear as I started using it in terms of how I interact with my patients and how I interact with myself as a clinician in terms of my confidence. Okay, so let's say you have somebody who is very good at throwing a ball, perhaps a professional baseball player who's a pitcher. They get paid millions of dollars to do this. They have had massive coaching and training and all sorts of things so that they become very, 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 very good at throwing a ball. Now, the way that they throw is the product of a lot of work, and as such, it becomes highly stable. In general, the same pitch they need to produce looks the same each time, right? Now, there is some small amount of variability, and according to dynamic theory, that's a good thing. So a small amount of variability indicates a very stable movement pattern, a preferred pattern of movement. In other words, their throwing technique. That's the pattern of movement, okay? Their specific technique. And obviously technique varies across people, right? But the same person's technique tends to be pretty stable. The fact that it is stable is called an attractor state or an attractor well. Think of an attractor state or an attractor well, basically the same thing, as a kind of a habit, a habitual movement. So the same technique over and over. If you want to change it, it's hard because that attractor well becomes almost like a black hole. Like it draws you in, it stays there. And so this is an old dog, new tricks. Like, how do you change your technique? Ooh, it's hard to do, right? Because that attractor well gets really high. But you can. It just becomes challenging. And as you're trying to change something, we have evidence that shows that a stable movement pattern, an attractor state, will become a lot more variable just before it transitions to a new movement pattern. So this is like if you were walking and you're about to run, like if you're about to go for a jog and you're walking to warm up and then you're about to run, your walking pattern will get kind of weird just before you start running, like a fraction of a second before. That's typical. In a rehab context, a person who's been, they have foot drop, they have all kinds of things going on with their knee and their hip, and they're walking with that kind of unusual big circumducting hip out, foot flopping, hitting the ground really loud pattern. As you're trying to train that out, get them to actually freaking, flex their hip, flex their knee, dorsiflex the ankle, things like that, the way they move is going to get really strange all of a sudden. It's going to feel like it's abrupt. And this is dynamic theory. This is the variability in movement that can be a precursor to change. So this is kind of a good thing. I would say in terms of application for neurorehab, if you are working with a patient who's had a condition for a really, really long time, or even like your low back patients, like your chronic low back peeps, the way they sit to stand will be very like unique to them. And then all of a sudden it changes. And I would say I see this a lot with like my Parkinson's patients. So Parkinson's is a condition that sometimes has the trunk attribute of what's called retropulsion. They lean back when they're upright, which is awful for sit to stand, right? I mean, you're going to tip backwards and sometimes they like fall off the couch and onto the ground. That's how they break a hip. So obviously we want to train that out. And just as I'm starting to break apart that motor pattern, I swear their sit to stands get so strange. Sometimes they lean to the side as they rise up to stand. They lean forward too much. They lean back even more than they did. It becomes like strange, a lot of variability. And that tells me that we've lost the attractor state. That attractor well is now really shallow and they're ready for change. So that can be upsetting as a clinician, but it actually means like you're actually doing your job. Now you have to be consistent, and this is when consistency can matter. And we'll talk about motor learning later, but that's to give the idea of how we acquire new motion, yeah? Okay, let's go ahead and pause here and we'll jump over to the next.